In 1972, a small team at MIT built a model that did something nobody else had dared to do. It tried to simulate the future of the entire world, not just one country's GDP, not just one market, but population, industrial output, resource use, pollution, and food production. Together as a single dynamic system. They fed the best data they had into a computer, ran different scenarios, and watched the curves. In most of those runs, something unexpected happened. The system didn't glide into infinite growth. It surged, peaked, and then declined. Not because of a single disaster, but because growth itself hit limits and started to unravel the very foundations that made it possible. The report they published was called The Limits to Growth. In 2026, those limits aren't a theoretical graph anymore, they're turning into lived reality. The team behind the model was led by Donella Meadows, Dennis Meadows, Jürgen Randers, and William Behrens, working under the umbrella of the Club of Rome. They used a method called system dynamics, pioneered at MIT, to capture feedback loops. How one part of a system pushes back on another. Population growth drives demand for food. Food production requires land, water, and energy. Industrial growth ramps up resource extraction and pollution. Pollution feeds back into health, agriculture, and ecosystems. None of these variables move in isolation. They push and pull each other in time, delayed, nonlinear ways. The crucial insight was simple and brutal. If you let exponential growth run inside a finite system, you don't get a smooth landing. You get overshoot and collapse. They ran multiple scenarios. In the standard run, which assumed business as usual, continued growth in population and industrial output, modest technological progress, no major policy shifts. The model showed global industrial production and food per capita rising through the late 20th and early 21st century, peaking somewhere around the 2020s or 2030s, and then declining. Why? Because resource depletion and pollution eventually caught up. As non-renewable resources got harder and more expensive to extract, more of society's effort had to go into simply maintaining supply. As pollution accumulated, it eroded health, agriculture, and ecosystems. The system didn't collapse overnight. It strained, slowed, then slid. At the time, critics mocked the model. They said computers were primitive, data was incomplete, humans would innovate their way out of any constraint. And to be fair, some of the early interpretations were too rigid. The authors didn't claim inevitable doom. They argued that without fundamental changes in how growth was pursued, the risk of hitting hard limits was high. They also ran alternative scenarios: aggressive pollution control, resource efficiency, lower material throughput, stabilizing population. In those stabilized runs, the curves flattened. The system didn't collapse. It leveled off into a kind of dynamic equilibrium. Fast forward to 2026, and the chilling part isn't that every detail of the model was right. It's that the overall shape of reality has tracked surprisingly close to that standard run for roughly 50 years. Population, industrial output, resource use, pollution, all rose together faster and faster, and now multiple indicators are flashing strain. The limits to growth moment isn't a single crash. It's the feeling that the old assumption, more is always better and we can always scale it, is quietly failing across several fronts at once. Take energy. For decades, fossil fuels powered growth with seemingly endless reserves. Then the easy oil was gone. We moved offshore, into deep water, into unconventional sources. At the same time, the climate system started pushing back. More extreme weather, heat waves, fires, floods. The response has been a massive push toward renewables and electrification. But the transition itself requires staggering amounts of materials: lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, pulled from a finite planet. The limit isn't just, do we have enough hydrocarbons? It is, can we swap out the entire energy infrastructure of civilization fast enough without breaking other parts of the system? Think about water. Many of the world's major aquifers, the underground savings accounts of fresh water, have been drawn down for decades faster than they recharge. Rivers like the Colorado, the Nile, and the Indus are under pressure from competing demands: cities, farms, ecosystems, power plants. Climate shifts change rainfall patterns, making droughts sharper and floods more intense. Water is the hidden variable behind food, industry, energy, and health. When it strains, everything strains. Consider soil and food. The Green Revolution massively increased yields through fertilizer, irrigation, and crop varieties. Global calories per capita rose. But those gains came with trade-offs: soil degradation, dependence on fossil fuels for fertilizer, vulnerability to pests and climate shocks. In many regions, topsoil is eroding faster than it builds. Fisheries show similar patterns: decades of overharvesting followed by plateau and decline. Again, the model's logic shows up. Exponential extraction inside a finite regenerative system produces a boom, then a slowdown, then a risk of collapse. Overlay population on top of that. The world's population exploded from around 3.8 billion in 1972 to over 8 billion today. For a while, that growth was an engine. More workers, more consumers, more ideas. Now, the picture is more complicated. Some regions still have fast growth and struggle to provide jobs, housing, and services. Others, like much of East Asia and Europe, are aging and shrinking, facing pension and healthcare burdens that assume a younger base of workers that no longer exists. On a planetary scale, more people means more demand for material throughput. On a regional scale, fewer young people can mean brittle social systems. Either way, the old assumptions about demographic tailwinds have hit their own limits. There's also waste and pollution, the model's polite term for what we dump into air, water, and land. In the early 1970s, climate change was barely on the mainstream radar. Today, CO2 isn't an abstract line on a chart. It's behind shifting climate patterns that affect agriculture, infrastructure, and entire regions' habitability. Plastic, once a miracle material, has become ubiquitous pollution, from oceans to the bloodstream. Chemical runoff, microplastics, air particulates, these are the externalities that the model treated as feedback variables. For decades, those feedbacks were weak enough to ignore. Now they bite. But the deepest echo of the 1972 model in 2026 isn't just in physical constraints. It's in systems behavior, the way our responses sometimes make things worse. When a system approaches limits, there are two broad paths. One is adaptive. Recognize constraints early, change values, redesign structures, aim for sufficiency instead of endless more. The other is extractive. Push harder, exploit remaining buffers, shift costs onto someone else or into the future. So far, much of our response has been extractive. When one region runs low on water, it imports food from another. When one country tightens environmental rules, production moves to a looser jurisdiction. When growth slows in the real economy, we manufacture financial growth through credit and asset inflation. That's classic overshoot behavior, using buffers and complexity to hide stress rather than easing it. It works until it doesn't. If you felt in your own life that everything seems more tightly wound than it used to be, supply chains snapping with small shocks, prices spiking from localized defense institutions, feeling one crisis away from overload, that's what living near limits feels like. It's not cinematic Mad Max collapse. It's systems losing slack, fewer margins, less room for error. If this is clicking for you, take a second, subscribe, and in the comments, say what country you are watching from and which limit feels most real in your daily life. Energy costs, housing, climate impacts, food prices, water, something else. Seeing where the strain shows up for real people is more valuable than any abstract model. The original limits to growth work wasn't fatalistic. It said, explicitly, collapse is a possible outcome, not a destiny. The difference between the grim scenarios and the stable ones came down to a few big shifts. Choosing lower material throughput. Investing heavily in pollution control, stabilizing population through education and empowerment, redesigning economies around quality rather than quantity of growth. The hard part is that those shifts require changing what we reward. A company whose success is measured purely by sales volume has no built-in incentive to respect planetary limits. A government whose legitimacy is measured only by quarterly GDP has no simple way to sell enough instead of more. When in 1972, that was theory. In 2026, it's a daily political and cultural fight. Every debate over fossil fuels versus renewables, over urban sprawl versus density, over degrowth versus green growth, over consumption patterns, is a fragment of that larger question. Can a growth-oriented system redesign itself in time, or will external limits do the redesign by force? Here is the uncomfortable twist. Hitting limits doesn't necessarily look like a single dramatic crash. It can look like a long plateau of growth without progress. More activity, more throughput, more noise, but less real improvement in well-being, people working harder to stand still, economies growing, while median lives feel stuck or declining, environmental indicators worsening even as we deploy more technology to manage symptoms. In system dynamics terms, that's a system stuck in corrective loops that never reach a new equilibrium. If you think about your own environment, your city, your country, ask yourself, do the new buildings, the new roads, the new data centers, the new consumption actually translate into a deeper sense of security, health, and meaning for most people? Or does it feel like the volume is going up while the signal stays the same? Your honest answer is an indicator of how close your corner of the world is to its own limits to growth. If content like this is helping you name patterns you've sensed for a while, subscribe and drop a comment about which area you think is most overdue for a limits conversation in your society, energy, housing, work hours, consumerism, something else. And if you're in a position where a $100 level contribution wouldn't hurt you, but would help keep long-form independent analysis like this alive, consider it. For most, that's too much, and that's fine. For some, it's a rounding error. For this kind of work, it's oxygen. The 1972 MIT model was never about predicting exact dates. It was about showing that exponential growth inside finite systems has a characteristic shape: surge, strain, then either adaptation or decline. In 2026, we are well past the surge, deep into the strain. You can see it in climate volatility, in infrastructure crises, in geopolitical competition over resources, in psychological burnout, in the sense that more stopped answering why. The limits to growth aren't an abstract warning anymore. They are the background context of every major decision, from national budgets to personal life plans. Recognizing that doesn't mean giving up. It means stopping the pretense that the old game can be played forever and starting the much harder work of deciding what is actually worth sustaining when more is no longer on the menu. In 1972, when the MIT team published The Limits to Growth, critics accused them of underestimating human ingenuity. And they were partly right. Over the next 5 decades, technology pulled off a series of miracles. Crop yields soared. Energy extraction went deeper and farther. Medicine extended lifespans. Global trade stitched continents together. From a distance, it looked like the model had been defeated. Growth didn't stop in 2000 or 2010. It kept going. But that's exactly how overshoot works in complex systems. Feedbacks are delayed. The bill shows up years after the party, and by the time you see the full cost, you've already spent the principal. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the 1972 work is that it didn't say, we run out of resources and everything collapses because there's literally nothing left. That cartoon version is easy to dismiss. What the model actually showed was subtler. As key resources become harder and more expensive to extract, more of society's effort has to be devoted just to maintaining the flow. You don't have to hit zero oil, zero phosphorus, or zero rare earth metals for growth to stall. You just have to reach the point where the marginal cost of pulling out the next unit and cleaning up the damage eats more and more of your total capacity. At that point, you can have growth on paper, more dollars, more work, more throughput, without people feeling richer. You can already see that dynamic in energy. Early oil fields were like sticking straws into pressurized underground lakes. Today's production leans heavily on deep water drilling, tar sands, shale, and other unconventional sources that require far more capital and technology per barrel. Renewables are ramping fast, but they require massive upfront investments in grids, storage, and mining. The cheap, easy phase is over. What we call energy transition is, in system terms, a race. Can we build a new energy infrastructure fast enough to avoid both climate feedback shocks and an affordability crunch for billions of people? The same pattern shows up in infrastructure. A lot of the world's roads, bridges, power lines, pipes, and buildings were built in a period when materials were cheaper, populations were younger, and environmental constraints were looser. Now, many of those assets are aging at the same time. Just as maintenance costs rise and tax bases strain, it's far less glamorous to repair a bridge than to announce a new mega project, but repairs are what keep a system functioning. When maintenance is deferred long enough, you don't get a neat decline. You get sudden failures, blackouts, water crises, transport shutdowns that ripple far beyond the asset that broke. The Limits to Growth model was fundamentally about feedback delays, the gap between cause and effect. Emit greenhouse gases today, feel the worst climate impacts decades later. Degrade soil today, only see yield drops after years of cumulative damage. Overfish a stock today, discover the collapse when it fails to rebound after a bad season. Those delays create a psychological trap. As long as the curves are still going up, any warning sounds alarmist. By the time the curves flatten or bend down, the leverage you had to change course is much smaller. In 2026, we live inside those delays. Climate patterns are shifting in ways that strain agriculture and infrastructure, but the full consequences of past emissions are still in the pipeline. Populations in some countries are only just beginning to feel the cost of decades of underinvestment in health systems, education, or public space. Economic models are still calibrated on assumptions of future growth that look less plausible every year. When you hear phrases like secular stagnation, polycrisis, or permacrisis, you're already hearing modern language for what the 1972 team was trying to capture: multiple reinforcing constraints pushing a system out of its old regime. There is another layer the MIT group hinted at, which feels far more visible today: psychological limits. A system can hit material ceilings, but it can also hit human ones. Burnout, anxiety, loss of meaning, these are real constraints on how much complexity and acceleration people can absorb. A world where everything is always upgrading, disrupting, as in scaling, is also a world where many people feel permanently behind. The original model didn't have variables for attention, mental health, or social cohesion. If you added them now, their curves would show their own version of overshoot. At the same time, there's a paradox. While planetary systems strain, a lot of our day-to-day economic logic still operates as if the world were infinite. Companies are rewarded for maximizing throughput and engagement, not for minimizing harm. Governments chase headline GDP because that's the metric voters, and markets have been taught to watch. Individuals are encouraged to consume as an expression of identity. It's as if the operating system is still grow first, ask questions later, while the hardware, planetary boundaries, social cohesion, personal resilience, is quietly hitting CPU at 100%. If this is resonating with how your own life feels, more speed, less slack, more choice, less clarity, hit subscribe. And drop a comment about the area where you most feel that mismatch between the infinite growth story and the finite reality around you. It might be as concrete as water restrictions or as intangible as mental overload. Either way, those observations are the ground truth version of the model. The original limits to growth scenarios showed a fork, overshoot followed by collapse, or overshoot followed by conscious stabilization. The difference wasn't magic technology, it was values and timing. Societies that chose to prioritize basic needs, equity, pollution control, and population stabilization before the peak could land in a high-quality, low-growth world. Societies that waited until after the peak found themselves fighting over shrinking pies, with less capacity and more chaos. Right now, much of our politics is stuck in a third, more dangerous non-choice, promising to maintain high consumption and high growth while also delivering sustainability, political stability, and full employment without spelling out the trade-offs. It's an everything for everyone story that only works if limits done to really exist, or if they can be pushed far enough into the future that someone else has to deal with them. The MIT model's uncomfortable message is that systems don't care about our narratives. They respond to flows, stocks, and feedbacks. There's a personal angle here, too. Individuals are starting to make limits-aware decisions even when institutions don't. Choosing fewer but more durable things over fast fashion. Moving to places less exposed to climate risk. Changing diets, work patterns, family plans, in response to a felt sense that the old trajectory is unstable. These are micro-adaptations. They don't fix the system by themselves, but they signal a shift. More people are quietly stepping off the infinite growth escalator in their own lives. If long-form breakdowns like this help you think more clearly about where you want to stand in that shift, subscribe, and let a comment record what kind of adaptation you're already making or thinking about making. And if you previously were in a position where parting with something like $100 to support independent analysis would not harm you, consider that this kind of work is itself a public good in an attention economy biased toward distraction. For many people, that's unrealistically high. For some, it's less than a weekend impulse buy. For projects like this, it's fuel. The most important thing to remember about the 1972 model is that it was never about predicting a date when the world ends. It was about showing the shape of trajectories in a finite environment. We are now living near the inflection of those curves. The temptation is either denial, they were wrong, we'll always find a way, or fatalism, it's too late, nothing we do matters. Both responses miss the point. Limits don't erase choice, they redefine its terms. The question for 2026 isn't whether growth has limits, it's what we choose to grow. Skills, relationships, resilience, justice, wisdom, when material throughput can no longer be the unquestioned measure of success.